A drunken man snapped in fury, wrapping his hands around a tiny shepherd puppy's neck just because a bottle shattered at his feet. His twisted laughter echoed through the cold night as he kicked the helpless pup into the snow-covered road, leaving it gasping for life. But on the other side of the fence, a silent witness stood, a hardened Navy SEAL veteran living quietly with his loyal K-9 partner. In an instant, both rushed into the storm to lift the dying puppy into their arms. That moment ignited a breathless fight for survival. Stay until the end to witness how 3 souls defied the darkness. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country below, and if you believe every soul deserves a fighting chance, hit subscribe for more stories like this. The storm hammered Maple Crest with a blizzard so fierce it erased the horizon in a sheet of white silence. Inside the small cabin on the hill, Daniel Vance sat beside the cast-iron stove, a man carved by war and winter alike. Daniel was 41, broad-shouldered, tall, with the kind of posture that came from years of discipline rather than pride. His face, framed by uneven dark brown hair and a short, rugged beard streaked with early gray, carried the weary dignity of someone who had seen too much. His eyes, deep, storm-colored blue, held both distance and vigilance. A jagged scar crossed his right eyebrow, a quiet reminder of a night overseas that had changed him forever. After leaving the Navy SEALs, he had withdrawn from crowds, preferring solitude, routine, and the company of the only partner he trusted without hesitation. Bear. Bear, an 11-year-old retired K-9, lay curled at Daniel's feet. The dog's sable and tan coat bore patches of old scars, each telling its own silent chapter of service. His muzzle had faded with age, but his amber eyes were alert, loyal, and sharp as ever. While Daniel often spoke little, Bear understood him better than any human could. The pair shared a bond built on battlefields and broken nights, on the unspoken promise that neither would abandon the other. It was, in many ways, the only constant in Daniel's frayed world. The wind howled around the cabin like a wounded animal, shaking the old wooden panels. Daniel took a slow sip of black coffee, feeling its warmth spread through the cold ache lodged in his chest. He was used to storms, inside and out. But tonight, something felt off, as if the blizzard carried a warning. Bear sensed it first. His ears snapped upward, body tensing, muscles tightening as he rose with a low, rumbling growl vibrating from his chest. Daniel straightened in his chair, the soldier in him awakening instantly. He followed Bear's gaze toward the frost-blurred window. At first, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Then a figure emerged in the storm's veil. Thomas Hale. Daniel's jaw tightened. Thomas was Daniel's neighbor, a man in his late 30s with a stocky build, a round face perpetually flushed red from a lifetime of cheap liquor, and a temper as unstable as winter ice. His unkempt beard, greasy blonde hair, and heavy hobbling gait made him instantly recognizable. Daniel had witnessed the man drunkenly scream at fences, curse at the wind, and throw tools into his yard with no apparent reason. But tonight something darker clung to his movements. Daniel leaned closer to the window, fogging the glass with his breath. The snow parted just enough for him to see Thomas gripping something small, too small. A puppy. A German shepherd puppy no more than 3 or 4 months old, with oversized paws, soft black and tan fur, and a trembling body barely heavier than a loaf of bread. Its ears were half flopped, half perked in that awkward stage of puppyhood, and its tail tucked so tightly under its belly it shivered like a trapped leaf. Even through the storm's roar, Daniel could sense the panic radiating from the tiny creature. Then came Thomas's voice, slurred, venomous, slicing through the wind. "You stupid mutt! You spilled my whiskey, my damn whiskey!" Daniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. Bear growled louder. With a violent jerk, Thomas's hands tightened around the puppy's neck. Its legs kicked helplessly against the snow. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears, a familiar darkness rising in his chest. the same darkness he had spent years trying to lock away. He could almost smell the sand and gunpowder again, hear distant echoes of screams and orders shouted over explosions. His body reacted before his mind finished registering the danger. "Easy, Bear," he whispered, but even he could hear the tremor in his voice. Outside, Thomas roared another curse and, with a swift, brutal motion, hurled the puppy onto the ground. The little body hit the snow with a thud that made Daniel flinch. Then came the kick, hard, savage, and deliberate, sending the helpless creature sliding across the yard and into the street like discarded trash. The puppy lay still. For a heartbeat, Daniel could neither blink nor breathe. Rage, pure, razor-edged, filled him like wildfire. The instinct to storm out and break Thomas in half surged inside him, but years of training pressed a cold hand on his shoulder. "Don't move until you secure what matters." Thomas staggered back toward his porch, muttering curses, searching for another bottle of alcohol. That brief moment was all Daniel needed. He moved quickly, silently. Bear followed without a sound. Snow bit into Daniel's face as he stepped out, but he didn't feel it. He skirted the side of the cabin toward the shared fence, kneeling beside the small metal utility box. With the precision of a man who had done 100 covert tasks, he popped the cover, pulled out the security camera's memory card, and slipped it into his pocket. The camera faced Thomas's yard. It had captured everything. Evidence. Unshakable. Undeniable. Enough to end him. Only then did Daniel turn toward the limp shape lying in the snow. The puppy was barely breathing, its chest rising in uneven, stuttering jerks. Its small pink tongue hung at an odd angle, and frost had already begun collecting on its whiskers. Daniel dropped to one knee, his gloved hands trembling despite the cold he no longer felt. Gently, he slid one arm beneath the puppy's fragile body, feeling the alarming chill that seeped through its fur. "Easy, little one. Stay with me," he murmured, his voice softer than he remembered it could be. The puppy let out a sound, a whimper so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. Daniel unzipped his thick winter coat and pressed the puppy against his chest, letting his own body heat envelop its frozen form. The puppy's head slumped against him, weightless as a wilted flower. Bear nudged Daniel's arm, anxious, protective. Daniel nodded, jaw set. "Let's move." "Now." He sprinted toward the truck, Bear right at his heels, paws pounding through the snow. The night was still raging, but the mission had already begun. The road vanished beneath the fury of the storm as Daniel slammed the truck door shut with his shoulder, cradling the trembling puppy beneath his coat. The engine groaned to life, its old pistons struggling against the cold. Wind hurled itself against the windshield in furious sheets, the glass rattling as though the blizzard was trying to claw its way inside. Daniel tightened his jaw, frost gathering in his dark beard, and shifted the truck into gear. Beside him, Bear jumped into the passenger seat with practiced agility, though his movement carried the stiffness of age. The old K9 shook snow from his coat, his amber eyes locked onto the small bundle pressed to Daniel's chest. Daniel kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other wrapped protectively around the puppy under his jacket. The tiny body was frighteningly limp, its fur damp and cold as ice. He could feel shallow, stuttering breaths against his shirt, but each one felt weaker than the last. His mind raced faster than the howling wind outside. He had carried wounded soldiers under fire, dragged bleeding comrades across sand and metal, but none had ever felt as fragile as this little life now fading in his arms. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the icy road. Maple Crest's narrow back roads were nearly invisible, buried beneath fresh waves of snow. Streetlights flickered like dying fireflies, offering no real guidance. Daniel leaned forward, squinting into the blinding white, his storm-gray eyes sharp with determination. He had always been calm in chaos. That was what had kept him alive overseas. But tonight, something inside him shifted. This was not a mission ordered by command. This was something raw, personal, and it brought old memories crashing like thunder inside his chest. As the truck struggled past a bend, the puppy suddenly jerked beneath his coat. A violent spasm rippled through its small frame. Daniel swore under his breath, pulling the truck over as fast as the wheels allowed. He threw the vehicle into park and turned, clutching the puppy gently but urgently. Bear whined beside him, pressing his nose anxiously to the pup's tiny head. The puppy's eyes rolled back. Its limbs stiffened, then thrashed in jerky, uncoordinated movements. Daniel recognized the signs. A seizure. The cold, the trauma, the fear. It was all too much for a body so small. Daniel laid the puppy across his thighs and cupped its head, steadying it. "Easy. Easy, little one," he murmured, though his voice trembled in a way it rarely did. Bear, sensing danger, let out a low whimper and nudged the puppy's cheek with his graying muzzle. The seizure stopped abruptly. For a moment, everything was too quiet, too still. Daniel leaned in, his breath fogging the air between them. The puppy's chest no longer moved. The rise and fall that had been so faint before had now disappeared. Daniel's pulse slammed in his ears. He pulled the pup fully out of his coat and laid it, gently across the center console. Snowflakes blew in through a crack in the window, landing on the puppy's unmoving fur like tiny white ghosts. "No," Daniel whispered, the word catching. "Not yet. Not like this." He pressed one hand over the puppy's ribcage and began quick, controlled compressions, counting steadily under his breath. His other hand cupped the small muzzle, tilting its head back. His training returned in sharp, clinical fragments. Airway, breathing, circulation. But beneath that discipline, something fierce and aching burned through his chest. This was not just protocol. This was desperation. The wind screamed around the truck, rocking it violently. Bear pressed his body against Daniel's side as if lending strength. Daniel lowered his mouth to the puppy's nose and breathed a tiny puff of warm air into it. Then another, and another. His hands worked with mechanical precision, but his heart pounded erratically, memory and emotion clashing like opposing tides. He remembered cradling a teammate years ago as the man slipped away, remembered the helplessness eating him alive. That night had carved something permanent into Daniel, a wound that no time had managed to close. Not again. Not tonight. "Come on," he growled, voice raw. "Come on, soldier. Fight." Bear let out a soft bark, licking the puppy's cheek in frantic, delicate strokes. The old dog's breath fogged in quick bursts, his body trembling with fear he rarely showed. Still no movement. Still no breath. Daniel's hands froze for half a second. The storm outside swallowed the world, the truck shaking as though grieving with them. Daniel bowed his head, rage and sorrow twisting painfully in his chest. It wasn't fair. This life hadn't even begun yet. It hadn't known safety or warmth or love. It had only known fear and pain and cruelty. He slammed his fist once, quietly, against his thigh. "Don't die on me," he whispered. Then louder, sharper, almost a command. "Breathe." As if answering the call from some distant place, the puppy's chest twitched. A faint, broken gasp escaped its throat, so weak it barely stirred the air, but unmistakably real. Daniel exhaled shakily, closing his eyes in a moment of fierce relief. Bear barked once, high and hopeful. Daniel gathered the puppy back into his coat, holding it close to his beating heart. He touched its cold head lightly with his chin. "That's it. Hang on. I've got you." He restarted the truck, gripping the steering wheel with renewed determination. The clinic was still miles away through storm and darkness, but hope, thin and tremulous, had sparked to life amid the blizzard. This time, Daniel did not whisper to himself. This time, he made a promise out loud. "We're not losing you tonight." And with that vow etched into the storm, he drove into the white chaos, chasing the sliver of life he refused to let fade. The storm had worsened by the time Daniel skidded the truck into the parking lot of Maple Crest Veterinary Clinic. Snow had already buried the welcome sign, and the building's windows flickered with unstable light as the power grid struggled against the raging blizzard. Daniel shoved the door open with his shoulder, his breath steaming in the cold night air as he cradled the limp puppy beneath his coat. Bear leapt out beside him, his paws sinking deep into the snow, but the old K9 kept pace, eyes sharp, ears pinned back in distress. Daniel pushed through the clinic's entrance, the bell above the door giving a faint, pathetic jingle. Inside, the warm air smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. The front desk was deserted. No surprise this late in weather like this, but a voice echoed from the back rooms. "1 second." The tone was brisk, steady, the kind belonging to someone used to emergencies. A moment later, Dr. Sarah Whitmore appeared in the doorway. She was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with a frame that suggested she'd grown up working ranches or barns. Her auburn hair was pulled into a messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame a face both firm and kind. Freckles dotted her pale skin, and her eyes, sharp, compassionate hazel, held the quick, assessing intelligence of someone who made life-or-death decisions daily. She wore navy scrubs beneath a fleece-lined vest, and her gloved hands were stained with ink and iodine. "Daniel," she said, surprised to see him at this hour. He rarely visited town unless absolutely necessary. Then her eyes dropped to the bundle in his coat. "Dear God, what happened?" Daniel didn't bother with the story. His voice came out low, tight. "He's fading." That was enough. Sarah gestured sharply. "Follow me." She led them into the emergency room, a small but well-equipped space of stainless steel counters and humming machines. The lights flickered overhead, threatening to die every few seconds. "Power's unstable," Sarah muttered, pulling on fresh gloves. "The generator's fighting for its life." She lifted the puppy gently out of Daniel's coat, her practiced fingers moving with delicate urgency. Bear stood at the side of the table, his old body trembling. Sarah checked the pup's pupils, temperature, reflexes, then pressed her stethoscope to its tiny chest. A shadow crossed her face. "He's severely hypothermic," she said slowly, "and his breathing is shallow, very shallow." She angled the pup's head, her expression tightening. "There's swelling, significant. Looks like a cranial injury, possibly a concussion, but..." Her voice softened. "It might be a hematoma." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Tell me what that means." Sarah met his eyes. "A brain bleed, and if that's the case, he's minutes, maybe seconds, from dying." The old surge of helpless fury rose inside Daniel, the same he'd felt years ago when a teammate had bled out in his arms after an explosion. His breath stuttered, but he forced it down, locking his emotions behind the hardened shell he'd built in the military. "Fix him," he said quietly, not as a request, but as a vow. Sarah hesitated. Not because she lacked skill, she was one of the best vets in the county, but because the storm brought risks no textbook covered. Lights flickered again. The overhead monitors beeped uncertainly. "Daniel." "If the power cuts mid-procedure..." "Do it," he said firmly. Bear pressed closer to the table as if adding his own plea. Sarah exhaled, squared her shoulders, and nodded. "All right, prep him." She moved fast. Oxygen, warming blankets, emergency injectables, scalpels, suction, all arranged with the precision of someone who had fought too many battles against time already. Daniel stood at the head of the table, Bear at his leg, both silent sentinels as Sarah began the procedure. The puppy lay motionless under the surgical lamp, his fur damp and patchy, his breaths thin as threads of fog. Sarah made her incision with steady hands that did not falter even as the lights flickered dangerously overhead. Minutes crawled by. The storm howled outside like a living beast. Then the heart monitor let out a long, piercing sound. Beep. Bear whimpered. Daniel felt something inside him crack. "No," he muttered. Sarah's head snapped up, eyes wide. "He's coding." The room froze. The world froze. That single flat line hung in the air like a blade. Then, a tiny jump, a blip, a tremor of life. The monitor beeped weakly, irregular but real. "He's back," Sarah whispered, almost afraid to breathe. The puppy lay still, unconscious, but his tiny heart beat on, thin, trembling, refusing to surrender. Daniel lowered his hand into the warming chamber, letting the puppy's head rest against his palm. He whispered, voice low and steady, "From now on, your name is Orion." The pup did not stir, but the name felt right. A beacon born in darkness, a survivor beneath the storm. The lights died without warning. 1 second, the surgical lamps glowed over Orion's fragile body, and the next, everything snapped into darkness with a harsh metallic click. The entire clinic seemed to inhale sharply as though the building itself felt fear. A low hum sputtered from the walls, followed by silence so complete it pressed against the ears. Then came the distant roar of the blizzard, battering the windows in furious waves as if nature itself had joined the battle for Orion's life. Daniel reacted first. His instincts, honed through 14 years of missions in deserts, jungles, and ruined cities, ignited the moment the power dropped. He yanked the tactical flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, the narrow beam slicing through the suffocating dark. His scarred hands were steady, but deep in his storm-gray eyes simmered a fear he rarely showed. The beam revealed the outline of his rugged face, shadows catching on the sharp angles of his jaw, the rough patchwork of beard, the faint ghost-like scar across his eyebrow. Sarah inhaled sharply but did not freeze. Her training as a veterinarian wasn't military, but she had spent years working emergency barns during wildfire season, stitching up animals in barns with smoke-darkened air. She had known chaos, but not like this. Still, her hazel eyes hardened with the resolve of someone who refused to let fate dictate the outcome. Her freckled face glistened with sweat despite the dropping temperature, and she pushed a loose curl of auburn hair behind her ear before leaning over the table again. "Generator's dead," she muttered, voice tense but controlled. "And without heat, his temperature will crash fast. We have minutes, maybe less." Bear stood at Daniel's side, his aging body trembling in the cold but his eyes locked onto Orion. The old K9's fur bristled with silent worry, and small puffs of fog escaped his muzzle each time he whined softly. Though his hips were stiff with age, Bear pressed himself close to the table, as if proximity alone could shield the puppy from death. Orion convulsed violently. The small body jerked under the thin blanket, limbs stiffening before trembling uncontrollably. The flashlight quivered in Daniel's grip. Orion's eyes remained shut, but the pain radiating through his tiny frame was unmistakable. Every twitch, every strained movement betrayed the chaos inside his skull where the hematoma fought to take another life. "Seizure!" Sarah barked, moving to stabilize the puppy's head. The temperature in the room plummeted with the loss of the heating system. Frost began to creep across the metal instrument trays, and Daniel's breath became visible with each tense exhale. The cold wrapped itself around their legs like a merciless predator waiting for a moment of weakness. He lowered the flashlight, angling it carefully so Sarah had the exact light she needed. His large frame, broad shoulders, thick arms forged from years of tactical conditioning, cast a protective shadow over the table as he braced himself for whatever came next. His heart hammered with the same desperation he'd felt when holding dying soldiers far from home. He had sworn long ago that he would never let someone die in his arms again. Not this pup. Not tonight. Sarah worked quickly, her fingers steady as she reached for her remaining tools. Without suction, proper lighting, or warm air, she resorted to pure skill. She inserted a needle at the emergency site beneath Orion's skull to relieve the pressure. Her gloves shook from cold, not fear. Sarah hadn't realized she was holding her breath until she whispered, Come on, little one. Stay with us. The seizure worsened. Orion's small body arched in agony, then collapsed into terrifying stillness. He's crashing, Sarah whispered. Daniel didn't need the monitor to tell him. He pressed 2 fingers to Orion's chest, his own breath stalling. No movement, no heartbeat. Bear whimpered loudly, pacing in tight, anxious circles. Then, Orion's chest stilled entirely. Move! Daniel's voice dropped into the controlled calm he only used in life or death moments. He scooped the puppy up, laying him flat on the towel. His large hands, calloused, strong, once stained with the dirt of faraway lands, began rhythmic compressions perfectly timed. His voice, low and sharp, counted beats under the roar of the storm outside. Sarah stood by his side, the dim light tracing the worry etched into her features as she prepared an airway tube. "Daniel, if this doesn't work—" "It will," he said through gritted teeth. "He came back once. He will again." He didn't say the rest aloud. "I won't lose anyone again." He lowered his mouth to Orion's tiny muzzle, giving a breath measured and gentle. Then compressions, then breath again. His actions were steady, precise, strong enough to revive, gentle enough not to cause more damage. Bear climbed onto the lower shelf of the table, lying beside Orion, the warmth from his aging body spreading toward the puppy. Sarah blinked, startled by the instinctive gesture, but did not interfere. For a long moment the world narrowed to the sound of Daniel's breaths, the thump of his compressions, and the storm hammering the windows. The room was cold enough to sting exposed skin, but none of them moved away. Then, a twitch, barely more than a flicker under Daniel's palm. "Again," he murmured, feeling the tremor of life. "Come on." Orion's chest shuddered once, then rose in a weak, wavering breath. Sarah gasped. Bear barked, once, sharply as if declaring victory. Daniel exhaled shakily, his broad shoulders collapsing with relief. "Good boy," he whispered. "Keep fighting." The pup lay still, unconscious but breathing. His heartbeat was faint. A fragile rhythm, but a rhythm, nonetheless. Sarah placed a warming pack near his small body. That was impossible," she whispered. Daniel shook his head, eyes never leaving Orion. "No, just a miracle made by 3 stubborn souls." The storm raged on outside, but inside that powerless room, life, thin and trembling, had chosen to stay. Morning arrived slowly over Maple Crest, dragging pale sunlight across the thawing drifts of last night's blizzard. The storm that had nearly stolen Orion's life had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a fragile quiet, a quiet that Daniel had learned never to trust. He stood outside the veterinary clinic, breath curling into the crisp air, his broad frame still tense from the night's adrenaline. Frost clung to the ends of his dark beard, and fatigue carved deeper shadows beneath his storm-colored eyes. Bear stood beside him, stiff but alert, his aging body still radiating protective energy. Though the old K9 was exhausted, his amber eyes scanned the surroundings with the discipline of the warrior he had once been. Daniel didn't linger. He needed to return home briefly, check the generator, refill supplies, and secure the property. He also needed time to breathe, even if it would be painful. Some scars never softened, and danger, no matter how brief, always awakened old ghosts inside him. When he pulled into his driveway, the first thing he saw was Thomas Hale stumbling across the snow like a drunken specter. Thomas was wrapped in a filthy jacket, one sleeve torn, his blond hair matted against his flushed, unshaven face. The man looked like the storm had chewed him up and spit him out, but the fury twisting his expression burned hot and misguided. His voice echoed across the yard, slurred but venomous. "You!" he bellowed, stabbing a shaky finger at Daniel. "Where's my dog, you bastard? You took him. I'll sue you. Daniel stepped out of the truck with the heavy calm of someone who had faced real threats, men with rifles, explosives, and murderous intent, not drunken cowards trying to rewrite their sins. He shut the door with measured control. His tall figure, wrapped in his weather-worn coat, cast a long shadow across the snow. "You're hung over," Daniel said quietly, his voice as steady as the winter earth. "Think before you open your mouth." Thomas didn't. He surged forward, breath sour with alcohol, face twisted with indignation. "That mutt is mine. If you touched him—" Bear growled, low and dangerous. The old K9 positioned himself between Daniel and Thomas, hackles raised. Despite his age, Bear still carried the authority of a dog who had learned to track explosives, tackle suspects, and protect officers under fire. Thomas flinched but did not stop. "I'll call the cops. I'll have them." "You won't need to call them," Daniel said. As if summoned by fate, a patrol vehicle turned onto the road, tires cracking over icy patches. 2 officers stepped out. Deputy Collins, a stout man in his early 50s with a weather-beaten face and a thick gray mustache, and Officer Ramirez, a tall, sharp-eyed woman in her late 20s whose dark ponytail whipped in the cold wind. Both had holstered sidearms and the professional posture of people accustomed to community disputes, but they stiffened upon seeing Thomas's aggressive stance. Collins sighed, rubbing his temples. "Thomas, folks heard you yelling from 3 houses down." Thomas puffed up, righteous and dripping with false indignation. "Good. Arrest him. He stole my dog." Ramirez raised a brow. "Is that so?" Daniel said nothing. He simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the small memory card he had taken the night before, and nodded toward the house. "Inside. I'll show you exactly what happened." They entered Daniel's cabin, warmth radiating from the wood stove, though the air still felt heavy with the echoes of the night's terror. Bear sat beside the couch, eyes trained on Thomas like a silent judge. Daniel plugged the memory card into his laptop, the screen's glow illuminating the room. What played next erased every lie Thomas had been ready to tell. The footage displayed Thomas clearly, his unsteady gait, his drunken slurring, his hands tightening around the puppy's neck, his rage-filled curses, the brutal kick that sent the small body sprawling, the puppy lying unmoving in the snow, barely breathing. Thomas's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no sound came. Even the alcohol in his bloodstream seemed unable to shield him from the horror of his own actions replaying in unforgiving clarity. Officer Ramirez's expression hardened. Collins shook his head, muttering a curse under his breath. "Thomas Hale," Ramirez said, her voice sharp as ice, "you're under arrest for felony animal cruelty, endangerment, and intentional harm. Turn around. Hands behind your back." Thomas tried to back away. "Wait. No, I didn't. It was just, he knocked over my whiskey." Collins snapped the cuff shut with no sympathy. "You put that pup in critical condition, that's not just anything." Thomas turned toward Daniel, his expression wavering between hatred and fear. You set me up." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. His voice dropped into a cold, steady register, a tone sharpened by years of seeing the worst men could do. "You chose to hurt something that couldn't fight back," he said, "but you chose the wrong night and the wrong person to witness it." Ramirez guided Thomas out the door. Collins nodded toward Daniel. "Good work bringing this in. You probably saved his life." Daniel only gave a silent nod. As the patrol car pulled away, Bear pressed himself gently against Daniel's leg, sensing the shift in the air. Daniel exhaled, long and slow, snowflakes melting against his beard. Justice had finally arrived, delayed, but not denied. Now there was only one mission left, helping Orion finish the fight he had barely started. The weeks that followed passed like a slow spring thaw, each day melting a little more of the darkness that had once clung to Daniel's life. Orion remained at the veterinary clinic for nearly 12 days after the night of the blizzard, fighting through swelling, tremors, and a fragile recovery. But the little shepherd had the soul of a survivor. When Sarah finally cleared him to leave, on strict rest and monitoring, Daniel carried him out in his arms as though cradling the smallest ember of hope he had ever been given. Orion had grown a little since that terrible night. His fur, once dull and tangled, now glimmered in hues of soft sable and tan. The bruising around his head had faded to faint shadows beneath his eyes. His legs were still unsteady, occasionally giving out beneath him when he stepped too fast, but his spirit, bright and unstoppable, burned hotter each day. Even the way he lifted his muzzle to sniff the wind held innocence and determination. Bear accepted the new addition with the quiet authority of an old sentinel. Despite being 11 years old with graying fur and slowing joints, he walked with dignified certainty. His once powerful shoulders had softened slightly with age, but the intelligence in his amber eyes had only sharpened. Bear had always been Daniel's anchor after service, a calm presence with the instincts of both warrior and guardian. Now he took on another role: mentor. On Orion's first morning at the cabin, Bear approached him with deliberate patience. The old K9 nudged the puppy's shoulder gently as if saying, "Stand tall." Orion wobbled, legs splaying, but he refused to sit. He tried again, falling onto his side in the snow. Bear circled him once, huffed softly through his nose, then did something unexpected. He lowered his head and lay beside Orion, pressing his warm side against the puppy's trembling body. Orion blinked at him, tail thumping weakly. Daniel watched from the porch, arms crossed over his chest. His tall frame was wrapped in a thick charcoal coat, his beard fuller now that winter's cold made shaving unnecessary. His skin, naturally sun-browned from past deployments, had regained some color after weeks of relative peace. But what had changed most were his eyes. The storm-gray intensity had softened. Where there had once been vigilance, now sat something gentler, an emotion he had not allowed himself in years. He stepped down from the porch and knelt in the snow beside the two dogs. The cold bit at his knees, but he barely noticed. Orion looked up at him, head tilting with that curious innocence only a young animal possessed. The puppy's gaze held trust, pure and unquestioning, a kind of trust Daniel had not felt worthy of in a very long time. "Easy there," he murmured, running a hand gently over Orion's small head. The puppy leaned into the touch, eyes half closing. Bear bumped his muzzle into Daniel's elbow, not wanting to be left out. A quiet chuckle escaped. Daniel, a sound Bear had not heard enough in the past few years. In the days that followed, the cabin found a new rhythm. Bear became Orion's constant companion, guiding him through short walks across the snowy yard. Each time Orion's legs wobbled, Bear slowed his pace, allowing the pup to lean against him for stability. When Orion barked his first shaky bark, more of a squeak than a sound, Bear responded with a deep, approving woof. Daniel caught himself smiling more often. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the wood stove with a cup of coffee while Orion slept curled against Bear, the two forming a warm, breathing bundle on the rug. Daniel would watch them, feeling an unfamiliar peace trickle into his chest, softening the scars he carried both outside and within. He realized something quietly powerful. The night he saved Orion had forced him to confront every shadow he had tried to bury. His nightmares, the guilt of lost teammates, the cold emptiness that had followed him home from war, they had loosened their hold on him the moment he held that little life against his chest and refused to let it die. One windless evening, sun setting behind the pines in a wash of gold, Daniel sat on the porch steps. The air smelled of pine sap and melting frost. Bear lay on the left, his body relaxed in a way old soldiers rarely allowed themselves. Orion bounded clumsily across the yard, tripping over his own paws before racing back to nuzzle Bear's ear. Bear tolerated it with saint-like patience. The scene was simple, ordinary even, but for Daniel it felt like something sacred. He breathed in deeply, feeling his chest expand without pain for the first time in years. The wind brushed through his hair. It didn't howl like a battlefield. It whispered like peace. "I thought I was saving you," he murmured under his breath, eyes softening as Orion toppled over his own tail. "But maybe you're the one saving me." As the last light dipped beneath the tree line, Orion curled against Daniel's side, resting his small head on Daniel's boot. Bear lay down beside them, completing the circle, and in that quiet sunset, the new pack, one old warrior, one broken soldier, and one pup born from a storm, finally felt whole. Winter softened its grip on Maple Crest in the weeks that followed, trading razor-sharp winds for gentle flurries and pale sunlight that lingered longer each day. Snow still blanketed the rooftops and pine branches, but the cruel bite of the blizzard had faded, replaced by something warmer, quieter, almost hopeful. It was during this slow shift of the season that Orion's story began to ripple through the town like a long-delayed spark finding tinder. Daniel never intended for anyone to hear about the night in the storm. He was a private man, shaped by years of deployments that taught him to carry his burdens quietly. His tall, weather-forged body, broad shoulders, scarred knuckles, the thick beard that shadowed the hard lines of his jaw, belonged to someone accustomed to disappearing into the background. But Maple Crest was a small town, and word traveled faster than melting snow. A clerk from the sheriff's office mentioned the arrest. Someone else heard about the emergency surgery. Miss Hollis from the bakery saw Daniel carry Orion into the clinic wrapped in his coat. Soon, whispers bloomed into stories. Stories into awe, and awe into admiration. But no one visited more often than Dr. Sarah Whitmore. She arrived at Daniel's cabin every few days, sometimes every day, with her medical bag slung over her shoulder and her auburn hair tucked beneath a wool hat. Sarah was the kind of woman who carried warmth even through the cold. Tall, composed, with freckles that brightened her pale cheeks whenever she smiled. Her hazel eyes held that practiced blend of intelligence and compassion that made frightened animals trust her instantly. She checked Orion's reflexes, monitored the swelling near the skull, inspected his gait, and always ended with a soft scratch beneath his chin that made his tail thump eagerly. But she rarely left immediately after the examination. There was always tea to share, always a conversation waiting in the quiet. Daniel found himself speaking more than he expected. Slowly at first, guarded, but Sarah had a way of listening that made words loosen from the tight places inside him. She never pushed, never demanded details about the scars that weren't visible, but she understood silence. Perhaps that was what he valued most. Bear approved of her almost instantly. The old K9 would rest his gray-muzzled head on her knee during checkups, his tail sweeping the wooden floor in slow, deliberate arcs. Orion adored her even more, each visit sending him bounding toward the door with newfound energy, though his legs still wobbled adorably when he moved too fast. One Saturday morning, a stack of envelopes appeared at Daniel's porch. He assumed it was misdelivered mail, until he saw his own name printed on each envelope in careful handwriting. Inside, the first letter was a small watercolor sketch of Orion with a note that read, "Thank you for fighting for him when no one else did. Lydia Hawkins, age, Wood 10." Another envelope held a knitted scarf for Orion, crafted by an elderly widow from Evergreen Road. Another carried a handwritten note from a veteran who simply wrote, "Your bravery reminded me that some fights are still worth showing up for." Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time, the letters clutched in his calloused hands, the cold forgotten. Something warmed behind his ribs, a place he had believed frozen for years. A week later, a journalist from the Maple Crest Chronicle published a full-page story titled, "Orion, the puppy who returned from the storm, and the soldier who refused to let go." The article featured a photograph of Daniel kneeling beside Orion and Bear near Sarah's clinic. Daniel had not realized Sarah was watching him that day when the picture was taken. The soft smile on her face in the background made it into the print as well. The town loved the story. Donations poured into the clinic to support emergency equipment. Local schools invited Sarah to speak about animal welfare. Children stopped Daniel on the sidewalk to ask about Orion and Bear. Daniel accepted the attention with quiet grace, though he still preferred the silence of his porch with the dogs at his feet. Yet the world's sudden affection didn't bother him as he expected it would. Perhaps because Sarah was there through it all, smiling gently whenever someone thanked him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm when he looked overwhelmed. One evening, after she finished checking Orion's coordination, Sarah lingered beside the wooden kitchen table. Orion lay sprawled with his head on Daniel's boot, Bear settled loyally at the other side. The kettle whistled softly as Daniel poured 2 cups of tea. The warm glow of the lamp softened the hard lines of his face. Sarah watched him, her cheeks pink from the chill of the night. "You know," she began quietly, fingers wrapped around her cup, "there aren't many people who would do what you did out there." Daniel shrugged slightly, the movement humble. "Anyone would have done it." "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "Not anyone." Silence filled the space between them, comfortable, unhurried. Daniel had spent years surrounded by noise he didn't choose. Gunfire, engines, shouted orders, the ringing pulse of survival. But this silence, shared with Sarah, was something else entirely. It was gentle. It was safe. She reached down to scratch Orion's ears. The puppy wagged his tail wildly, the same tail that had once lain limp in the snow. "You gave him a new life," she whispered. Daniel looked at her, not just her words, but the way she said them, as though she understood that giving Orion a new life had, in some quiet, unexpected way, given Daniel one too. In that moment, the truth settled softly between them like falling snow. Orion, the tiny soul once thrown into a blizzard, had become the invisible thread that stitched 2 lonely lives together. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something neither of them had dared hope for. In the quiet, after every storm, there is always a choice: to turn away from suffering or to reach out and save what little light remains. Orion's story reminds us that miracles still walk this earth, often carried in the hands of ordinary people who refuse to let darkness win. Perhaps God's grace does not always arrive as thunder or revelation, but as a small heartbeat returning in the cold, or a stranger choosing compassion when no one else would. And those choices ripple through the world in ways we never expect. If this story touched you, share it so others may believe in hope again. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more stories of courage and grace, and may God bless and protect you and your loved ones wherever you are tonight.